Is this on?
Yes, my lord.
Good. Hello, this is God speaking. Can we dial that down?
Yes, my lord.
Thanks. Welcome, new arrival to the Eternity Ward. Please take a number and make your way down to the left or the right to the waiting room. All you need is the refreshments I made just for you. I would tell you to steer clear of the apples, they're forbidden, and the 2 snakes. I mean, fools, sorry, that are chewing the fat in the corner, but you probably wouldn't listen anyway. So good luck, I bless you, and on your way.
Welcome to the Eternity War, where we sit around, chat with our buddies and wait for an appointment with God, and where we would like to do an acknowledgement of country this week, where we acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, recognise their continuing, eternal even, connection to it, and where we pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'm Chris Adams.
And I'm Nick McKinnon.
We've started with an acknowledgement to country this week because we have a guest joining us for a conversation around Indigenous issues, specifically relating to Australia Day, or as some see it, Survival or Invasion Day. And, you know, we sort of missed the boat, Nick, on making this topical and getting it out by Australia Day because it's post-Australia Day now. But I heard a lady lamenting that the topic only gains traction, only sort of gets into the mainstream consciousness. It's sort of like a week or two out from the day, and we should be talking about it all year sort of thing. So
we started early.
Yeah, that's the conclusion I've come to. Yeah, we're on the ball.
People will say we're late, Chris. They don't understand.
No. I should introduce our guest.
Introduce.
Okay, Skye Leon. She's a 28-year-old Aboriginal Australian woman. She grew up with 3 younger siblings, 2 wonderful parents. More recently spent 5 years working with disadvantaged young people in their communities in the UK. She was based in Oxfordshire and Berkshire, and she put this sort of a little bit of a bio together. She put those names of those places in there to see whether I would pronounce them correctly. She's also an aspiring filmmaker. She hopes to inspire compassion, love, and laughter through the storytelling of film. I wouldn't say she's an activist, but she is a friend of mine, and we've invited her along to talk about this topic because it's something that I imagine matters a lot more to her. And so welcome, Skye.
Thank you. And you didn't do too bad with the county names.
Oxfordshire, is that correct?
Yeah, Oxfordshire.
Berkshire.
And Berkshire.
Oh, I was terrible then.
I was being polite. No, you did all right.
So how long have you been back in Australia for?
Oh, since the end of September. So what's that, 4 months?
I'm not good at counting.
It is 4 months.
But you still retain a bit of an accent there.
I think it's only when I'm concentrating on my conversation. But I think, I mean, it's fair to say I spent the majority of my 20s thus far in the UK. So I think that has an effect on what you sound like.
So if we hear you falling back into Aussie bogan language, that means that we've lost you and you just have no interest in the conversation whatsoever.
Oh, no, I've given it away. No, it's probably because, I think I adapt a little bit to my surroundings and what I hear.
One other thing that you also put in your bio was that you come from you're going to have to explain which people you belong to because I don't think I can pronounce it.
Yeah, I've actually got a little bit more information too than what I sent you. So I have, on both sides of my family, Aboriginal heritage. Both of my parents have an Aboriginal parent and a non-Aboriginal, non-Indigenous parent. So on my mother's side, we come from the Lardil, Yarngal and Gungalita people of the Gulf of Carpentaria in Queensland. And from my father's side, we come from the Warramai people of the northern coastal area of New South Wales, around the Foster-Tungurri area.
Okay. Mm. And we've got you on to talk about, Australia Day. So what did you end up doing this Australia Day just gone? And when you see it coming up in your calendar, is it Australia Day to you? Is it Survival Day? Is it, what would you call January the 26th?
Yeah, what would I call it? I think I'll get into it a little bit more, but for this year, I actually just spent the evening hanging out with girlfriends, eating Indian food and watching a very funny Bollywood movie, as well as responding to some comments on a post that I shared reflecting on what Australia Day means to me currently. And if I were to call it, to give it a label, I think I would probably choose Survival Day at this point in time.
It was your posts that actually have led to you coming and talking here, because I was wanting to go to a march, a Survival Day march that was happening in the city, but I was actually working that day. So I didn't get to go, but I did see that a lot of my friends were in attendance and were posting about it on social media, and I was just sort of following that a lot on my phone while I was at work instead of working. And then I noticed that, you'd put up a post that was getting a few responses and so on. And it's not something that I normally see you doing, making posts of a strong sort of social and personal nature. And so I was just interested, why have you started doing that now? And there's also been a bunch of posts that you put up since as well. You seem to be on some sort of a journey of self-exploration, or you've just decided to change your tack and have a bit more of a voice on the subject at the moment. Yeah, why now?
Yeah, thank you. I think journey of self-exploration is a good way of looking at it. I think in answering the question, I want to split it into two parts, really. The first part, I'd like to sort of help you understand why I haven't been that vocal in the past, and then sort of share what it is that's compelled me more recently to use my voice, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think I should preface anything that I say tonight with the acknowledgement that I am probably going to refer to my culture and my people a lot for the purposes of this chat, to refer to Indigenous culture and Indigenous people. But I want to make it really clear straight away that I also consider non-Indigenous Australians to be my people, and that Indigenous culture and the Indigenous peoples of Australia are a part of the Australian nation. So I'm not trying to make it a sort of them and us thing. Because it's our place, it's the Indigenous people of Australia's place in our nation and our experience of it that is so important for me to talk about. So going back to your question, why haven't I spoken? So I grew up on an Aboriginal reserve on Mornington Island, like I said, in the Gulf of Carpentaria, and that was until about the age of 7. And I was completely immersed in my Ladal culture there, the Ladal and Yungal culture. But then when my family moved to the mainland, where my younger siblings and I then grew up very conscious that we were members of Australia's Indigenous minority, where the prevailing culture around us is decidedly not an Indigenous one. So it was never really questioned why you shouldn't celebrate Australia Day. It's something people did and presumed everyone did. If you are Australian, you celebrate Australia Day. So speaking to one of my siblings, neither of us could recall a time during our school years where we were asked if we thought it was okay with Australia Day being celebrated on January 26th. We didn't think about it, and we acknowledge now that it's because we weren't educated enough at that point, and we didn't really have an understanding of the effect of celebrating Australia Day. We knew some of our Indigenous history, but we grew up in a non-Indigenous culture, and ultimately we wanted to fit in. So we purposefully didn't give it too much thought. Now, I realized just this week in preparing for this conversation, in chatting with my family, that my mother has always very passionately voiced her frustration at the treatment of her family and our people. But as a child, I would close off and feel embarrassed when she voiced her passion and expressed criticism or frustration. And as an adult, now I can retrospectively understand why that was, but I never used to. And what I think it was is that when I moved to the mainland, I moved from a community where I was treated just like everyone else, even though I was fairer skinned than most of my relatives there. But it doesn't matter to my people what color my skin is. The only person it did matter to actually was a non-Indigenous policeman's son, who, when we were in kindergarten, he decided he would group all the white kids in one group and all the black kids in the other group.
Oh, no.
And have a guess which group he put me in?
In the white group.
He did. And one of my aunties from the community was the kindergarten teacher, and she came out, apparently this is what I'm told, she came out and she said, "Skye, you're not white, you're black." And I apparently turned around and very assertively said, "I'm not black, I'm Aboriginal," which, so props to little kid Skye. But aside from that, I was treated just like everyone else. And then at the age of 7, I moved from that nurturing community to a community where Aboriginal people were a minority. And as a fair-skinned Aboriginal kid, I was told, you can't be Aboriginal, you're not Black. And I had moved to a community where Aboriginal people were often misrepresented, unappreciated, and even condemned, hearing things as a little kid like, oh, the Abos are just lazy doll grabbers or alcoholics. So though I wasn't always treated like I was different because I was fair-skinned and could blend in on a superficial level,
Yep.
I learned that my people were judged as different and therefore not as valuable or less than and less capable. So consequently, I grew up internalizing a lot of shame, actually, because of my Indigenous heritage. And yet, even as a small child, I was conflicted because I knew that that shame was unjust. But it was a confusing experience because I was hearing this stuff and internalizing it, but I had also experienced firsthand this beautiful, inclusive, compassionate, affectionate spirit of my people and our culture. So then as I grew older, I felt guilt as a teenager because privately I felt like in being affected by the prejudice I encountered and the racism, I felt on the inside like I had betrayed my family and my people and had somehow shown disloyalty. But now I know I can look back and realize that I was just a young kid trying to cope, to fit in and to survive, essentially. So when my mother vocally pushed back against the status quo at those times, I felt afraid, I guess, afraid that people would hear what she was saying and then think horrible, untrue, unjust thoughts about us, that ultimately I would not be accepted for who I am. And that's my perspective as a fair-skinned Indigenous kid. So you can imagine then what it would be like to be growing up as an Indigenous child with darker skin and encountering similar prejudices. So really, to answer the question, why haven't you used your voice sooner? I don't think I knew until recent years, maybe, that I was afraid to, that I wanted to remain out of public discussion of or debate for a lot of things, not just these issues, but particularly these ones, because it was easier to stay silent rather than encounter prejudice and ignorance in someone's view of myself and the people that I love.
That's a heck of a story, Skye. Thanks for sharing that. So now here you are wanting to share even more and have a voice now.
There's this great quote, being the movie buff that I am, that I heard from The Greatest Showman this week, which is that comfort is the enemy of progress. So what changed is I think I've become unavoidably dissatisfied with this supposed comfort because I have become more acquainted, more fully aware of the reality of my people that are still disadvantaged. Our culture is still abused through disrespect, through ignorance, and through apathy. And I've seen enough of the world to know that things don't change unless people stand up and commit to weathering their discomfort, to seeking out the roots of what I believe really is oppression so that they can be brought into the light and dealt with. I'm motivated by what I now understand to be a widespread sense of grief over the loss of culture and the reality that many Indigenous people in Australia do not experience equitable opportunities and freedoms, but instead experience mental, emotional, and physical distress due to prejudice that I have had firsthand experience of and institutional disadvantage. And to be considered equal on paper is one thing, but to be given fair access to the same opportunities and freedoms is what I want to see become reality. And so I can't just be held back by my fear any longer. I'm willing to pay that cost, if that makes sense. I don't want to make it sound like I'm a hero. I'm not. I'm not at all, but I am loved by people and I love people.
Go, Skye.
So that's answering your question.
Yeah, that's a long answer to a question. There's a lot in there. Like, I want to revisit a bunch of things that you said. Like, one of the questions I had was the anger and frustration that your mother had.
Yeah.
You know, where did that come from for her?
Sure. Well, it came from the treatment of her family and of her mother. So I also posted on Facebook recently some excerpts from a government website about my maternal home community of Mornington Island. My grandmother, her history is that her mother was Gunga leader from the mainland, coastal area of the Gulf of Carpentaria. And she was, we think, married, maybe not married, to a British man who in those days was then classed as her protectorate legally. He then was killed, kicked in the head by a horse when my great-grandmother was pregnant with their second child, who became my grandmother. So she was shipped to the mission of Mornington Island because her protectorate had died. My grandmother grew up on this mission and at a very young age was separated from her mother and her stepfather because my great-grandmother remarried on that community. All the children in that community were then forced to live in dormitories away from their parents. The children would be segregated after dinner in their dormitories. And then the boys got to see their families twice a week, the girls on Sundays, I think. So there's all this early stuff. But then my grandmother grew up. She ran the hospital at the age of 16 or 17 on the island. She nursed patients with, I think, typhoid. She speaks very highly of the doctors who came to serve the community, but there's a whole bunch of hurt that I haven't heard from my grandmother. But the things that I do know, I could go into a lot of detail, but the most helpful one that I think affects my mum the most is that when my grandmother moved back to the island with my grandfather and their children, there was a person who was appointed like manager.
Right.
My grandmother was an outspoken advocate for her people, and this man did not like her. I think Mum did some research in university to find out more about this guy, and he was actually a mercenary from South Africa, and this was the sort of person they put in charge of this island. He got the newspaper to print a cartoon of the Empress Fang. My grandmother has missing teeth. And so he created this propaganda to say, Empress Fang, don't listen to this woman. He couldn't get rid of my grandmother, but who he could deport off the island was my grandfather. So my grandfather was kicked off the island away from his family. And Mum tells this beautiful story of her mother and siblings being ushered into a car in the dead of night, being pushed by their uncles and members of the community, driven to a beach, put on a dinghy and rown out to sea. They met up with this mothership, this fishing trawler, were reunited. They went into this little cabin room and were reunited with their dad and my grandfather. So this is happening in, I think, the 70s. So my mother grew up experiencing all sorts of discrimination and seeing just how hard life was for her mother. My grandmother was friends with Eddie Mabo and was quite active and has been quite active and is a valued member of the Indigenous community in Queensland and in my home community of Mornington Island. But yeah, my family has endured a lot and my mother obviously feels very passionately about that.
Yeah. So a lot of what you were saying earlier was relating to you forming an identity.
Yeah.
One of the concerns I have is that, so like all the horrors that you've described and all the horrors you haven't described that have happened to Indigenous people, I'm sure there are people that deny that they happened, but those people are lunatics and idiots. So all that stuff happened, and it happened as a result of racism and a result of tribalism. So racism is a form of tribalism. It's not the only type, but it's one of them. And one of the fears I have is that Indigenous Australians are reacting to those horrors that have happened and are banding together in a tribe. And one of the things I hate more than anything else is tribalism. I hate when we attach our identity to a group of people and not to all of humanity or all of sentient beings is the group of things that I see myself as being. So I don't see myself as white. I don't see myself as Australian. I don't even necessarily see myself as human, although I do think, Kris and I have talked about this, but in terms of sentient beings, I think there's a gradient, and the more conscious you are, the more capable you are of experiencing pain, the more valuable your existence is. So, an ant's existence is less important than a dog's. A dog's is less important than a human's, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And so for me, sentient being is the only group that I see myself as being part of. And so if I see a dog being mistreated, that matters to me.
Sure.
It doesn't matter as much as if I see a kid being kicked, but it still matters. And when people start seeing themselves as white or black or part of whatever the racist groups are. Like, I think that's a terrible thing. And likewise, I'm not sure it's helpful to attach your identity to Aboriginal and say that, you know, when you talk about my people and that sort of thing, like, I know you prefaced it by saying that you also see yourself as being Australian and all that, but I just think that sort of language is counterproductive. Like, I don't think there's no malice behind it. I don't think it's Aboriginals are deliberately trying to be evil in the way that, obviously, this is going to sound bad, but obviously in the way that settlement happened. Like, there's no comparison between the two. But I think it is the same ideologies that when Europeans turned up, they didn't see people part of their own tribe. They saw people as being different to themselves, and that allowed themselves to justify horrendous things. So when you see yourself as being Aboriginal, I worry that that allows yourself to feel part of a tribe and therefore to see other people as not part of your tribe.
Sure.
What do you reckon?
I understand what you're saying on one level, I think. So please, you know, keep commenting if I haven't quite got it. But I'm not sure that I wholly agree, because I feel like it's kind of been proven in the beautiful diversity of humanity that we do have diversity and diverse cultures and different ways of seeing things. But I understand what you're pointing out about tribalism, and that it can divide and it can create false barriers in how people view one another. But I think that you can still have a diverse and different culture without having a barrier that then stops you from relating to another diverse culture and seeing them as part of the same family that is humanity. And in fact, I think that's a part of my Indigenous heritage and culture, I think, is that we see everyone, regardless of creed or color, as valuable. We are all related to one another, but we do have different culture and we do have different paradigms and different ways of seeing things. And in fact, we do have different experiences. And a lot of the negative aspects of the different experiences have come out of ignorance of how people have viewed one group as less than the other. But I don't want to throw valuing diversity and different cultures and different ways of doing things. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I sort of feel like the ideal is that we're all one people. I think there's room for diversity in that. And I think that if you don't have, you know, if we're all the same without diversity, then that's really boring.
Yeah.
So I do like diversity of culture. So maybe the question is there a fine line to tread between attaching your identity to a culture or to a tribe? Potentially, Nick, do you see a difference there?
Yeah, well, so Kris, do you see yourself as being white? Like, is that part of your identity, or do you see yourself as being...
I guess it is.
Yeah? Okay.
Just in the sense that I've become more aware of things like white privilege. So I know I'm white and I have a responsibility not to be blind of that, but not that I feel like I belong to any white tribe. I don't feel a part of anything like that. But for someone else wanting to identify as, well, I sort of feel like that if you, like Skye talking about Aboriginal people being treated as less than for so long. I mean, we started off the relationship with terra nullius, as if they didn't exist at all as people, but just part of the fauna. And then over time, we have made progress step by step, you know, recognition as people, getting the vote, so on. But I guess I sort of think about that part of the Bible where the sins of the father are visited upon the third and fourth generation, and that's meant to be a curse from God, which I don't see as that at all. I see it as actions in the past having long-term intergenerational consequences. And that's why all of this is still with us today. And if a group of people have been kept down and seen as less than for a long time, then before we can get to a place of feeling as one people, then maybe you're going to want to come together, even tribally. Maybe you're going to want to feel pride and to lift yourself from being looked down upon before you can feel like equality exists for you to be able to leave some aspects of that tribalism behind. You're both looking at me with furrowed brows. I must be rambling.
I think what I want to show my support of in one way with what you're saying, Nick, is that I don't think it's the right way forward. for Aboriginal, Indigenous, Torres Strait Islanders, I think it's unhelpful reacting to hurt causes people to say, no, let's look out for our own. Yeah, I don't think that's helpful to create another level of conflict or division. And I think it's important, actually, that ignorance of differences is at the heart of my difficulty with what I see as the legacy of January 26, 1788. And what I mean by that is it was ignorant for Britain to plant a flag and claim sovereignty over, Kris, you talked about it, terra nullius, over my ancestors' lands. And that ignorance was, you are less than us. We don't need to worry about you. We can take this land for ourselves. Now, at the same time, if the early settlers came in and said, you're no different from us, therefore conform to us, like the culture is lost because they didn't see the difference and value the difference either. There is difference, and we should celebrate it and appreciate it. Just saying that on one board, we're just all one, actually can cause similar oppression anyway by denying someone their own differences from you.
Obviously, there's differences. Yeah. Like, I'm not denying there's differences. Mm-hmm. Like, I think biology proves that there's differences between the genders, there's differences between different races, all of that's true. But I don't think that therefore means it's helpful for me to attach my identity to any of those. Like, I don't want to see myself as male, because that then means that anytime an issue comes up in the public sphere, like, all of us are faulty. All of us have these biases within us that we can't help. I can't help it that when some sort of issue comes up between a man and a woman, it is just within my biology to go, I am part of that tribe. So the best way for me to deal with that is to do the best I can to not see myself as male, to not see myself as Australian. Like, Kris and I have talked about this in terms of nations, that we're watching a game between Australia and Syria. Like, halfway through the game, we're like, why the hell are we supporting the Australians? It makes no sense. Just because I was born here, that's stupid.
Yeah, okay.
Like, I care about poor people. Shouldn't I just go, well, fuck Australia. I want them to lose. Like, how cool would it be if Syria made the World Cup with all the crap they've been through? Naturally, we can't help it. We attach ourselves to these identities and these tribes, and it's not good for us.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'd need to sit with what you're saying a bit more to see what my deeper thoughts are.
Me too.
Yeah, but my initial response is, yeah, I'm not sure if I agree, because I think identity is a complex thing and it's a real thing. And actually, a lot of us walk around not even, at least from my experience, unless we do the work to understand who we are and what's formed us and how we see the world, then our actions can have positive and negative consequences from how we interact with the world based on who we think we are and what we think we're capable of. There is a communal aspect to that. So I would need to think a little bit more on what you're saying. But my general sense is I'm not sure that I quite agree with you. I think I admire your intentions, but I don't quite know if that's a thing that can be fully achieved.
Yeah, I'm more with you. But Nick and I have had that discussion of, is it even possible to sever yourself from all tribes, especially when identity and belonging are so integral to us? You know, we label ourselves with all sorts of things. The most unhelpful usually being when we throw labels at others, though. Yeah,
so we're fighting against biology. I'm not denying that. Like, it's very natural to want to feel like I'm part of a tribe. It feels safer. It feels a lot safer for me to plant a flag and I am part of this group of people. I'm not trying to tell you that it's natural for us to not. One of the issues I have with that premise is it goes back to tying it all into the weight of history. So I caught a bit of a documentary the other night where there were white people that were going and taking Aboriginal children, I don't know how far back, but they were taking Aboriginal children from their families and putting them in white homes and getting them to work, to do housework just as servers within the household. But they would take them away from their families for a decade.
and teach them these white ways. And, you know, when they came to get the kids, the families would be trying to hide the kids in the cane fields and stuff to try and keep their kids with them. And so in our history, we have white people coming and taking Aboriginal people away from their families, putting them in white households, teaching them white ways. Then we have also a history of where we're trying to actually, through interbreeding and stuff, actually breed out colour. You know, that's, so we have this whitewashing. We have a history of genocide, you know, all of these massacres, but we have also this history of trying to, you know, sneakily sort of eradicate this particular culture and this particular race. So if you're going to then ask someone to leave that culture and, but I know that you're not asking them to come and join your tribe.
No.
That would be different. You're asking, you know, let's
get rid of tribes.
Yeah, but that's easier said than done.
I suppose one thing, like maybe it's superficial, maybe it's not, but people are created differently. People think differently. People choose differently. And some people, it's that kind of thing of like, why are there so many different denominations of churches? Sometimes I get really frustrated by that. And then I realize, well, it's because people are different and not everyone sees eye to eye. But I'm glad that for me and my faith, I'm glad that my fellow brothers and sisters in Christ can have somewhere they go to connect with people and receive the fellowship and the teaching, the scriptural teaching, et cetera, that they need. But it's the same as, why do some people join different footy clubs, or why do some people join different chess teams and not go to the movie club or to the, like, we all have different interests, and then we group with people who share common interests. And then, you know, even in that sense, where we're talking about a like culture that you're born into or a family that you're born into, but it's important to us. Yeah, I don't see why valuing that, ideally, it shouldn't get in the way of people coming together as one still.
It shouldn't, but it does. You talk about different denominations. In Northern Ireland, you know, 4,000 people got killed because they're a different denomination.
Yeah.
Like, these things do have massive impacts, not because of any real reason. It was just because, well, you're Catholic and you're Protestant, so we hate you.
Well, yeah, but sure, but I don't know that I would agree with your statement, not because of any reason. I think there are reasons, and the reasons are that humanity at its worst manipulates one another with false division. Now, that's something that's not right. Just because something can be turned bad by ignorance or jealousy or hatred or apathy doesn't mean you should get rid of it altogether, because if that were the case, we'd get rid of human beings altogether.
Yeah, but so for me, black and white doesn't exist. Like, it's a false division in the way you said it.
That's a very easy thing for a white person to say as well, I think. Because if you had grown up as an Aboriginal person in Australia, I think you'd feel quite differently.
I agree, and that's what I'm saying is wrong.
Yeah.
I'm not disagreeing with that whatsoever.
Yeah.
I'm saying that people, when they've been a victim, or their people have been a victim or whatever, a way to deal with that is to attach your identity to those other people. Like, you see it in wars.
Sure.
Like, people that have gone to war with other people, they will die with those people that they went to war with. And then, you know, there was that, I think it was World War I, where in the trenches Christmas Day happened and they started singing Christmas carols, and they went, holy shit, these people on the other side that we're shooting at, they're normal human beings.
Yeah.
You know, when we go through these horrific things together, our tribes just become stronger.
Sure, but I don't think that Indigenous people identify as Indigenous simply because they've experienced trauma. In the same way that I don't think you'd identify as being a member of your family merely because you experienced trauma with your family. Like, I would hope that one day if I have a family that I'd be open to inviting people who weren't biologically a part of my family into my family home, into my relationship with my family. But at the same time, they're still not established as my family. If that, I'm not sure if that's a good argument. But yeah, I don't think trauma is the only thing that is responsible for Indigenous people identifying to be a part of the Indigenous culture.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Aboriginal. I always have been. It was something that, yes, I was taught by my family, but also it was something that I grew up into as I experienced a culture that nurtured a certain way of seeing things and a certain way of doing things that I think is really beautiful. It's not just through trauma that brings us together.
Yeah, right. So what are some of the other beautiful aspects, not related to trauma, that draw you into that culture?
Yeah, sure. I think the sense of family, the fact that in the community that I grew up, the best experience that I have to be able to share from is that we are all connected to one another. We may not all be a part of the like same biological nuclear family or whatever, but I have aunties and uncles who may not actually be my, as the Western point of view would call them aunties or uncles, but they relate to me just so. I have many grandmothers and many grandfathers because of that same reasoning as I was growing up. That's what it was like. And so I could roam freely around this island with other kids and know that I would be safe and that adults would be looking out for me. Yeah, so that sense of community, of caring for one another and of looking out for each other, so much so that I think it impacts how I view people. Today, I see someone on the street, and if they need help, I don't just walk past them. I will try my best to help. I've been reflecting on it lately, and I think, yes, part of that might come from my upbringing in my family values and my faith, but actually, I think those family values come from our Aboriginal heritage of everyone is important to everyone else. We're not just individuals, we are one. Part of that influences the way you see the land. And I feel really responsible for my environment because I value it, because I've been taught to value it. I think a lot of it has to do with relating, whether it's to people or your environment.
There was always one thing that I resonated with. I don't know if it was just one Aboriginal group or if it was more of a whole idea, a concept, but it's that you don't own the land, you belong to the land. And I always loved that concept. And I was like, I wish we all had that we belong to the land, because we're always, it's all about who owns which piece of real estate, when no, it's about, no, we belong to it. And because I feel like growing up, especially, I always felt like this land, it seeped into me somehow, and I am Australian, but I have found it harder to retain that moniker when I see people running around waving flags, especially on days like Australia Day. Just that concept. We belong to the land. I love that.
Yeah, it is beautiful. And I think the further we remove ourselves from our environment, like our natural environment, I think the worse off we are as human beings.
Someone's close to a bird. I heard a bird in the background. There's someone's
sorry. Let me close my
No.
window.
You're distancing yourself from the environment if you do that, Skye.
Sorry. I'm thinking technically.
No.
If you can go grab the bird and bring it inside, that'd be perfect.
Yeah, little birdie. Sing like Cinderella. Yeah.
So you were talking about like the positive impact growing up in an Aboriginal community has had on you and how it's shaped you. I'm interested in like how you think you'd be different if you had have grown up in a non-Aboriginal context.
Sure. I think that's a difficult one to answer because I obviously haven't had that experience. So anything I say is just guesswork and isn't going to apply to everybody. But I feel like my experience of Australian family life, and Australian family life is really diverse anyway. So that's a kind of tough thing to sort of like try and describe in contrast with Aboriginal Australian family life, is that, well, actually, I know I can say the culture shock of being a little kid and moving to the mainland and seeing that other people's families didn't always gather as big families and just come freely in and out of each other's homes. There was, appointments that you had to make, or is this okay time? Let's, when can we have that family barbecue, etc. I suppose maybe hospitality is a really important value that I've noticed in my Indigenous culture, of welcoming people in and not making them feel different. And so maybe that's one of the things that's been hard in the formation of our nation, is that value for Aboriginal people has not been shared by the people who are now the majority around us, So that's a difficult thing to wrap your head around. The meaning that you read into someone else's actions cross-culturally, it's a difficult thing to grasp.
You mentioned earlier, Skye, and this is also relates to identity. And we are the Eternity Ward here, and we do talk a lot about faith and about doubt and spirituality and so on. So, and you mentioned that you're a Christian, but you're also an Aboriginal. And I remember going to Uluru as part of a cultural exchange program and meeting the Mudurjulu people and hearing about their spirituality and so on. So are there things that you retain of an Aboriginal spirituality that goes with your Christian faith? How did you come to your Christian faith? Can you answer those questions?
Yes, but I'll try not to do the long-winded version.
Okay.
I think Aboriginal people, I have less of an experience of Torres Strait Islander culture. Aboriginal people are very spiritual people. And my mum sort of says, you know, it's easy to see how Aboriginal people embraced Christianity because we are a spiritual people and embrace that faith, that understanding of the spirituality behind creation and creation of the environment, creation of people. So I think just the nature of my upbringing, perhaps I have less of an understanding of my Aboriginal heritage spirituality, in part because I left my community at age 7 and was in less contact with my culture than had I been living there, sort of growing up and getting to hear more and more stories and things. But I think just my family heritage paradigm, spirituality has always been an important thing and a thing that just comes naturally. And yet I, in my own life as a growing person, as a teenager, had to decide, what do I believe for myself? What do I see as true? What have I experienced that would give me faith? What experiences have shaped my faith? So yeah, I think my faith is important to me, my Christian faith, and I've thought about it a little bit about how, well, there's, you know, Aboriginal spirituality has all sorts of different creation stories with common themes. Like, for example, the rainbow serpent is a story that is told in a few different places, and I find meaning in hearing those stories. Do I believe that God is in the form of a rainbow serpent? No, I think I don't. But that's not to say I can't still read meaning in those stories and see them, how they overlap with my own faith.
So does that mean that you would primarily see yourself as a Christian?
I suppose so, but I feel like they're kind of overlapped in me. But yeah, if I was to like tick a box, then I would say that I was a Christian Aboriginal Australian person with British ancestry.
So you see yourself as Christian, but also as indigenously spiritual.
I think
is like you say, there's some overlap there. Does that mean that like Kris as a Christian would also be a whatever Indigenous spirituality is, or do you have to be Aboriginal?
No, I don't think you do. For me, it's an appreciation of my culture's spirituality. To me, I can appreciate it, but then anyone who is not Aboriginal can also appreciate it and experience it for themselves. I don't think Aboriginal people would want to not share it with others.
What part of Christianity makes you think I want to call myself a Christian and not just indigenously spiritual?
Sure. Just to make it easier for someone to have a better understanding and communication of what I mean, but the actual, is nuances the right word? More complex than that. It's the easiest thing to say straight off the bat. But then if we had a good long conversation about it, it might look slightly different to what you first think when you hear me saying that.
So you see them both as being pretty much the same thing, but in the ease of explaining it to someone else who doesn't understand Indigenous spirituality, you just use the term Christian.
No, I don't necessarily see them as the same thing. I think there's lots of overlap. To explain it most explicitly, my understanding of my own faith is that being in touch with spirituality and with the Creator and with what it means to be a spiritual being, I don't think that is exclusive to just Christians. I think that happens right around the world with everybody. And so therefore, people get in touch with their Creator and in touch with their spirituality. And I feel like, to me, my Christian faith has revealed to me a better understanding of that and put me in a better place for myself to have a more conscious relationship with my Creator God and with myself as a spiritual being.
So it's an updated version?
I don't know. Updated, is that the right way of saying it?
What is the right word?
It's like, it's contextually different, but yeah, I've never really had to think about it because no one's ever asked me. I've tried to think about it myself, but you know, it's like, well, this is what I believe. So I don't know.
I remember while I was in Uluru there was a group of Christians that were in discussion with this elder, and this elder was saying, one of the things we want to thank you is for, like, we already knew God, but thank you for bringing the name of Jesus to us. So now we have a name, So,
Sure.
And it was interesting,
Sure.
the Uniting Church recently, because they had always had a statement that they had brought Christianity to the Aboriginal people, and they've recently renounced their claim of bringing Christianity to Aboriginal people by saying that they recognise that God was already known to them.
Mm.
I found that interesting. But what I also find interesting is, like, earlier you talked about, family members being part of the mission. So a lot of the harm that has actually been done to Aboriginal people within the past was done in the name of Christianity. And here you are, a Christian.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile that? Is there any internal conflict for you there?
Yeah. It's the thing of, I am incredibly grateful for being able to have what I believe is a relationship with my creator through Jesus Christ. But what I'm not thankful, so someone's responded to my post on Facebook and said to me a couple of pretty offensive things, which they obviously didn't intend to be offensive. But one of them was that if colonization and settlement hadn't happened, then you wouldn't have received the gospel. And to that, in my heart, I was like, well, I'm thankful, but I am not thankful for the cost that was paid by my people for that to happen. So in terms of my grandmother growing up in a place that tried to essentially assimilate her and convert her into a Christian, which she eventually chose for herself, my issue with it is that actually the way in which the gospel and the way in which the Christian message was brought wasn't actually done in a very Christian way, because I don't think Jesus would have been very happy. In fact, when I was writing my notes about it, I was like, I think Jesus would have been pretty pissed, actually. I think Jesus is pissed about it, but then I don't know if Jesus would use the word pissed. And I don't usually use the word, but it kind of sounds fun to be a bit rebellious.
I've known you, Skye, for a long time because partly we both have worked within the same Christian organisation. That organisation has actually run festivals on Australia Day, which I'm sure you've had to be a part of. Running these festivals, Has there been an issue within you to go out there and run festivals on Australia Day for communities?
Sure. I think it relates to what I was talking about earlier, is that I haven't, up until recent years, really stopped to listen to my family and to wider Indigenous Australia to understand just why it's unhelpful to celebrate Australia Day on the 26th of January. So as a teenager, because the last time I helped to run a festival on Australia Day, I was 19 or 20, I think. Like I said before, it wasn't an issue for me because I wasn't really aware of it being an issue for me. It wasn't until I started to think about it more in recent years and to listen to why it affects people so much that I realized, actually, I'm not okay with celebrating Australia Day, which I think, by the way, we should have an Australia Day. I think we should have a day in which we celebrate who we want to be and what we want our values to be. But I don't think it should be on a day that causes pain to Indigenous Australians.
So you want the date changed?
Yes, I would like the date changed.
So what is it about the date of the 26th of January specifically that you object to?
Sure. For an Indigenous person, we can't just celebrate what Australia might be at its best when the anniversary Australia Day falls on marks the start of the illegal and ignorant occupation of our ancestors' homes. And that same pernicious ignorance has woven itself into our history as a legacy that still affects Indigenous Australians today. And I see you sort of wincing a little bit, Nick. So if you want me to explain.
I'm not sure that's what pernicious means.
Well, pernicious is, my understanding of pernicious is that it eventually leads to death.
No, it's an idea that seems good but is actually has negative consequences. So I don't think ignorance can ever be pernicious because I can't imagine how it has good things about it.
Oh.
Except for what Kris likes to talk about, ignorance is bliss.
Well, actually, that's a good...
But I could be wrong. I could easily be wrong.
From what you're saying, that's a really good point in a way, because what I'm saying is that the legacy of January 26, 1788, what I mean by the legacy of ignorance is that non-Indigenous Australia policymakers, laws, actions that have taken place in regards to Indigenous people have been said as being good, but good for who? Because it sure hasn't been good for Indigenous Australians when we're talking about things like White Australia policy and genocide and removal of children from homes. My problem is that that ignorance still exists today. For example, being told to move on and just get over it, that's a very ignorant thing to say to someone who is hurting. And the problem is that, okay, so colonization started with a group of people coming in and saying, you are not like us, you are less than us, therefore we can choose what happens to you, we can choose what we do to you. The same thing happens still today. It's coming up in the debate about Australia Day being on the 26th because Indigenous people as a minority are not being listened to enough to get to the point of where we change our date, because our experience of our own history and contemporary issues, either it's not being taken seriously or it's not being seen as valid, because it feels like we're being told, actually, we know what's best for you, and what's best for you is to get over it and to keep celebrating on this day, because what's best for all of Australia is that we move on in unity. But that's still dismissing the experience of people. Does that make sense?
I see that it makes sense for you, but no.
Okay.
So not only is it possible, but it's likely that you can listen to someone and not agree with them. So the idea that you say that the rest of Australia aren't listening to Aboriginal people, I don't know what to call that, but I think it's pretty obvious that Australia is listening and is having this conversation. They're not agreeing. Like, people disagree with me, and that's fine. It doesn't mean that I go around saying, oh, people aren't listening to me. People are listening to Aboriginal Australians, and a lot of white Australians are getting on board and agreeing with you.
Yes, that's
but not everyone
that's
does.
True. That is very true. Thank you, Nick. That's really important to say that it's true. A lot of people are listening, and a lot of people are having empathy and empathizing.
But even the people that are disagreeing with you are listening to you.
I feel like we do have a history of not listening, because I remember my father was helping to research a book on Aboriginal history. Well, it was more on first settlement history and their interaction with the Aboriginal people. And so I got to hear all of these stories from my father as he was doing all of this research into what had been happening, these horrific stories of things that have happened to the Aboriginal people. And then I'd go to school and it'd just be all Captain Cook and white history, and all of this stuff was being swept under the carpet. For me, that's not listening. So when someone says that they're hurting, I want to hear the stories. You know, I want a day that we get to hear the stories. So I feel like if someone's saying that they're not being listened to, there needs to be more listening. But I do agree that there are people that listen that disagree, and there are people that listen that agree, but there's still people that aren't listening. And as a whole, there's a history of not listening.
Why do you think it's worth focusing on those people?
Okay.
The people that aren't listening. Why focus on them?
It's a good question.
I think it's just one thing that we need to focus on. And like, I agree with what you're saying, that you can listen to someone and you can disagree with them, definitely. The complex thing in this issue is that I feel like Indigenous people what they're sharing is what this action, the effect that it causes, how they are experiencing this behavior. And people are saying, well, what are they disagreeing with? Are they disagreeing with Aboriginal people's experience? Because you can't tell someone what they're experiencing isn't legitimate. So what I'm advocating for here, Nick, is that too often, I think, there are attitudes that, again, what I'm, maybe I'm trying to sound clever in calling it the legacy of January 26, 1788.
I try and sound clever as often as I can.
Okay, very good. Maybe if I started sounding a bit more British, I'd sound even cleverer.
Oh, now you're clever.
Back, yeah.
That was really terrible, actually. But what I'm trying to get to is that too often the experience of Aboriginal people, it's changing. I'm not saying it's not changing, but I'm saying I don't think we're there yet. I read this article by this man named Dan Hanrahan, who said that he passionately supports Prime Minister Turnbull's assertion, I'm just reading it out now, that Australia Day should celebrate the Australian values of freedom, fair go, mateship, and multiculturalism. But he says in his article that he believes the date doesn't currently live up to those values. And I agree, because those values, we try to live up to them, but we are practicing them selectively, I think. And if we're practicing them selectively, then they are not values, because ignoring the voice of a minority when it says this is offending and hurting us and expecting us to get over it, to me, that doesn't practice mateship. That doesn't suggest equal freedom or a fair go or healthy multiculturalism. And I think all of Australia needs to ask itself, do we actually value Indigenous culture and Indigenous point of view when we are willing to dismiss and marginalise Indigenous Australians and their experiences of their own historical and contemporary situations? So I don't doubt that what you're saying, there is a group of Aussies who will say, look, I don't give a flying whatever. because they're apathetic, I think, or ignorant or prejudiced. But a lot of Australians do actually value, or at least aspire to value, Indigenous Australia and its culture. But to me, intention doesn't always guarantee performance. And that's what I'm experiencing at this point in time with this debate. It's upsetting, really, because to celebrate Australia Day on a day when sailors planted a British flag and claimed sovereignty over this land when there were people here, I feel like that's so ignorant. That moment in history was so ignorant, which caused so much hurt. And that's what Aboriginal people can't get past, is that we want to choose to celebrate who we are as Australian peoples on a day that started the destruction of life and culture, and which we're trying to preserve, but we feel like other people aren't wanting to preserve it as much with us if they're not listening to how we're experiencing our current situation. Sorry.
No.
I really can't see any logical explanation why we need to keep the date. And this is, to me, is an analogy of what it's like for Indigenous advocates to try and advocate for social reform or welfare reform or justice reform. And then the majority says, no, actually, we don't think that's the right idea. Because I feel like it can be a repeat of the past mistakes of saying, look, we know better than you. That's what's at the heart of this issue for me, is I feel like the national apology, for example, 10-year anniversary, what was I was 18, 19, about to turn 19. It was really important to me to see that. At the same time, I went into the gym where I worked that day, and there were two older ladies, and they were speaking, and I don't think they knew I was Indigenous, because otherwise I don't think they would have said it. You know, I'm a fair-skinned kid. I can't remember word for word what they said, but more or less it was, I don't know why he's apologizing when we did nothing wrong. And I thought, well, obviously you've never said I'm sorry for your loss to someone before. And it's this thing of realizing that I don't hold this current generation accountable for the mistakes of previous generations. What I do hold all of us accountable to is that we don't repeat the ignorant mistakes of our past generations by not giving Aboriginal people an equitable, equal opportunity to be a part of the decision-making process of their lives. The national apology, I read it recently, and I realized that it was an important time for us, but it's not all that it needed to be, because I read it again and Prime Minister Rudd read the words and he said, we are sorry for the removal of children. We are sorry to the parents. We are sorry for this. But what was missing in it was a reflection of what was it that caused those things to happen? What was the mistake that was made that caused the removal of children, that caused the breakdowns of families? And it was ignorance. It was ignorance in thinking that would be better because we know better than you do. And that's what I'm really passionate about, is that we can't let this continue if we are going to truly achieve reconciliation and truly care, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for all minorities. And that's what gives me hope, is that recently, I'm talking a lot, I'm sorry. But I'll just finish by saying what gives me hope is that recently we proved as a nation that we do value mateship and multiculturalism and fair go and freedom by what we were able to achieve for our LGBTQI community. And that wasn't a simple thing. But I want people to have the same enthusiasm and passion that they have for Australia Day and for changing the vote as they do for Reconciliation Week. Because reconciliation is not just for Aboriginal people, it's for all of us. It's an Australian thing. I'm sorry.
No, thanks for sharing that, Skye. Emotion is fine.
So you talked a couple of times about that Aboriginals are a minority these days, that you're not the majority voice in Australia. I mean, obviously that's not something that any person with historical knowledge would think is a good thing. I mean, that's a horrible thing. You guys should have charge over your own country. But the reality is you're a minority in a democratic country. Yeah. And just like any other minority, whether it be Muslims or whoever else, like Muslims might want to have certain laws in the country, but they can't just pretend they're a majority. They're not. And if you want the majority to support your views, you have to articulate them and win a conversation. And if you lose the conversation, you can't just say, well, they're just not listening to us and they don't care about us and they're doing the same things that happened to us 200 years ago. I don't think that's a helpful way of going about things. I think that's the tribalism part of it that I don't like, that you end up retreating to this is my people and it's those other bastards who just aren't listening to us. And I just don't think that's reality. I think obviously there are people who don't care and who are arseholes and who are the white nationalist people who, given the opportunity, would probably do the same thing as what happened 200 years ago. But that is a tiny minority these days. And most people, I think, they cannot understand the pain on your side of the fence. But there's some level of empathy where they go, that makes sense. I would be pissed off if I was in the same, in their shoes too. But that doesn't mean that you just roll over and agree with 100% they say. You still have to be convinced. You still go, well, I don't really understand how the 26th of January, like it's not a date of a genocide. If it was the date of a genocide, I would get it. I would be like, yeah, that's barbaric that we celebrate that day. But it's a white dude walks up a beach and puts a flag in the sand. I don't care about flags. I don't care about sand. I don't care about any of that.
I think for me, it's about what it represents. It's not just the simple action. It changed history.
But then you could point to a million dates that change history.
Well, one thing, you don't care about a flag and a sand. So what, Nick, would you care if we changed the date?
No, it wouldn't bother me in the slightest. I couldn't care less.
But I think I hear your heart that you want this to not just be, or we'll roll over and do what you say to appease you. You want us to get to a place of agreement together.
And you end up creating tribes on the other side of the argument where you're increasing the propaganda that white nationalists can use to make their tribe bigger. It's the same thing that happened with Trump, I think. And I think it's just an awful path that we could be going down if we just stay in our own tribes, refuse to listen to the other side of the debate and just retreat to our own, what's called echo chambers, which is so easy to do these days with social media.
Yeah, but I do put that question back to you though, Nick, of like, if the planting of the flag doesn't matter, then why are we holding on to this date?
To change something, you have to have a reason to change it. Like, I'm not going to get divorced unless there's a reason to do it.
Well, I've listened and I feel like I've clearly heard a reason.
Well, I don't think I have.
Wait, right. Okay.
Like, I understand. So settlement, there was horrific things that happened. I'm not saying that nothing bad happened, and I'm not saying that Aboriginal people should just get over it.
Sure.
But I'm saying that I don't get what the fixation with the 26th of January is. It's just a dude walked up a beach and planted a flag. He didn't shoot anyone. I mean, from all the stuff I've read, Phillips sounds like a pretty decent bloke. He was actually trying to rein in the racist pigs. I mean, there was a bunch of convicts that he was dragging with him. So obviously some of them were going to be, I don't know what the word is, but
pretty feral maybe is the word.
Yeah. I think this is the thing, is that I'm not protesting, if that's the right word, that original date and what happened. Well, I am, but I'm not fixating on that first date. I'm fixating on the fact that Australia identified that moment as the founding of our nation, when it seems clear to me from history that that moment was a wrong moment. We identified that date, that moment, that symbolic action to be the one that we say, that's when we started to be Australia.
If you want to go back further in history than that to say when did it become Australia, there's just no date. There's nothing you can go back further than that and say, well, I want it to be whenever the hell Aboriginals first stepped foot off whatever little boat they came off coming from Papua New Guinea to Australia or Indonesia to Australia. Like, there's no date there. So you look back in history and go, well, what date can we use? And that seems like a pretty decent one. Like, if you look at what Australia is today, Australia looks nothing like an Aboriginal culture. I mean, obviously, again, that's not a good thing. I'm not saying that, hooray, we screwed these guys over. I'm not saying that. But if you look at what Australia is today, like, I think January 26th was a pretty pivotal moment.
But it didn't bring the First Nation people along from the start.
Well, it didn't bring the Scottish people along either, or the Chinese people that have come since.
Why would it bring them? It doesn't need to bring them. The First Nation people were already here.
Yeah.
Wait, whoa, racist, Kris. Doesn't need to bring the Chinese along.
Hang on.
Why not?
I do like
Shouldn't it be multicultural?
I do like what Kris is trying to say, though. That
No, I'm serious. I'm not trying to be a pain.
No. The person that's planting the flag, I can see that as representing all of multicultural Australia. It's not just one white person, From that moment,
I'm not British.
Yeah, we come forward as this multicultural nation, but what it didn't do is it didn't acknowledge the First Peoples. It was terrible.
Yeah, of course not. They were ignorant.
Yeah. Right. So there's an infraction against the First People. That's the start So it's a symbolic thing. And culture is formed around symbols of meaning that we share and that we understand. And so for a lot of people, January 26th is a cultural symbol that we understand. It's the day that we celebrate this multicultural nation. But for one group of people, it means something else. And so then we're not all together on this. So let's find a date where we're all together. I actually think it'll happen. I think we are on the path, Skye. I actually think that when you talked about what happened with the LGBTQI stuff that happened all this year, I think that we're going to get there. I'm optimistic in that sense.
Yeah, I am too, Kris. I am too.
I hope it doesn't take a long time.
I agree with you. I think we're on the way, but I definitely agree with people who say that it can't be all about this issue and like changing the date. It's a bigger thing than that. We're talking about reconciliation, but we've still got a long way to go. And the things that are required for reconciliation is more than just like agreeing when we throw our parties. And so I think that's important.
What's more important, from what I can gather, than just changing the date is recognition of what happened. And, and if changing the date is part of that recognition, then that's fine. But recognition of what happened, that's why I'm like, why don't we have recognition within the Constitution as well?
And recognition of this is our shared history, actually. Because the last decade affects the next decade, etc. So we are the product of our history. And I feel like we would all agree that we do need more education around treatment of Indigenous Australians for us to grow in empathy and understanding of, okay, that's what happened then. That's the wrongs of the past. We don't want to repeat them. And we're not repeating genocide. We're not repeating a whole bunch of stuff. But I feel like there are still realities for Indigenous Australians today that education would go a long way in helping people understand why those realities are true, why such issues and such problems and hardships and disadvantages still occur, so that when we talk about them in a public forum, that more people have a better understanding and go, all right, let's do something about this. Let's make a change for a brighter, better future for all of Australians.
In the spirit of agreeableness, I wanted to say that I agree 100% that the date of Australia Day is very likely to change. Like, I can't see in 100 years it being January 26th. And when it changes, I think everyone has to get on board and go, yep, this is our new Australia Day, and I do not give a shit that it changed.
Yeah.
Like, the thing that scares me is that people will get their backs up and go,
I agree, Nick.
This is crazy left-wing people changing our culture and people feeling marginalised.
Yeah.
Do not become that person. When it changes, go, brilliant, that's cool. I'm all good with this change.
Yeah.
And I mean, you may not have been all good with the change. You don't have to lie to yourself. But also then just say, this is our new National Day. It includes Aboriginal people. Awesome. That's brilliant. We want that.
Yeah. What you're asking for, Nick, that I agree. I want that to happen. The problem is that our culture is one that is, we govern based on majority versus consensus. If there are more people saying yes, if enough of a majority says yes, then yep, we'll go ahead. But consensus is that thing of like, we don't move forward together until everyone is on board, not necessarily because they agree, but because they trust that we need to keep moving forward and I consent to this action. In an ideal world, to me, I feel like that's how we move forward, is we all can consent. But because our culture is, we choose by majority, you're right, I don't want to get to a place where there is this tribalism that happens because people are angry that they were left behind in this decision-making process because they disagree. But I feel like part of the change will come if we get to better understanding of each other. That's my hope.
Let's jump on board.
I'd love to encourage people, if they want to really think about this more, to talk to each other.
Yeah.
I long for the day when being Australian means sharing in Indigenous culture as well as every other culture that is a part of the big melting pot that is Australia. Sharing an appreciation and love and concern.
Cool. Well, thank you for coming on and sharing your story with us, Skye, and having a conversation with us.
Thank you for having me.
Letting us understand a bit more.
Are there places online where people can keep in touch with your thoughts and your ideas?
I'm generally a pretty private person. But in terms of like the Facebook...
We'll keep that as a no.
Yeah, look, I would love to engage with people who want to engage with respectful dialogue around this, I would find it helpful to hear what my fellow Australians think and to be informed by that and challenged by that. So I guess they could contact you guys to get to me. but I unfortunately,
right.
I'm not one of those people who has a website for that.
We'll just wait for your first movie and
yeah. You can come and boycott it or support it. If you look online, just like a quick thing, because I'm a bit silly. If you look online at the Hunger Games premiere, the European Hunger Games premiere in London is the first film, you will see an Australian flag being held up by a gigantic Dutchman, because I took my Australian flag and then I might be admitting a felony or something, but I got Kris and Liam Hemsworth to sign it. But it's really funny because you can see it in the background where all the fans are like huddled in like cattle behind these like railings next to the red carpet. And I think I found my blurry face behind Toby Jones as well. That was awesome. Thank you guys. I appreciate this opportunity to talk and hear different points of view and to be allowed to be vulnerable.
Yeah. Likewise. The reason we have this podcast is because we like having difficult conversations and we don't want to shy away from difficult conversations. And I've found that online is a bad way to do difficult conversations because you just end up hearing the wrong thing. So, these face-to-face conversations I find are much more useful.
Yeah.
So, we really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time here on the Eternity Ward. So it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from Nick.
And goodbye from me. No, please cut that out. Please cut that out.
God here again. Are you shaking your head incredulously or nodding in approval? Well, if you got something out of this episode, you could really help those poor idiots by contributing to or supporting the Eternity Ward. You can leave reviews on iTunes or wherever you listen to it. You can share it on social media or discuss it in your blog, podcast or fellowship group. Subscribe, like, nod your head, raise your fist, send a hallelujah. I don't know, but don't send a prayer because I'm kind of busy right now. Join the discussion in the comments section, ask questions, and do come back and join us again here on the Eternity Ward.